she wanted more children, and I don't know what the problem was, but it might have been she had a unusual blood type or something, I don't know, but anyway, I think she had several attempts but no other child, and she loved children. I tried to find out something about his father, and it was very hard because it was a sort of an unusual situation or something. She didn't know much about him, or she hadn't lived with him very long. But it seems that her husband, my husband's father, was the son of Francis Asbury Gullidge and a cousin whose name was Elizabeth Gullidge. But when he was very young, Elizabeth left Francis, and he never knew his father at all. But after he was married to Frank's mother and had died, this grandfather came to Georgia and talked with Frank's mother. I don't know whether my husband remembers him coming or not. He may. But I know he never felt very close to his grandfather at all. And when I tried to find something about it, well, he just wasn't interested at all, because I don't know what was happened. I don't know why his grandmother left his grandfather, because he did marry. I mean, he did have other children. But the reason I know anything about him is that a cousin of Frank's in Troy, Alabama, she's with the university there in the English department, was tracing the Gullidge genealogy back to England. And she wrote Frank a letter and said that she didn't know anything about his branch of the family at all. And would he write her what he knew about the family? Well, he knew very little. But then we got to know her, and she was very nice. And she said that I think it was her grandmother or somebody, I don't remember, had talked to her about, had told her about Frank's existence. And she would just like to know more about it. So we went by to see her and liked her. And she said she was going to compile a history of the Gullidge family, but she wasn't well, and I think that she either got sick and couldn't do any more to it or died, and I don't know, because her family didn't inform me. I did meet her family, but she was the one that we talked to.
But you did mention earlier something about a Gullidge manor in England.
Well, that's what, I got all this from her. She went to England to trace the Gullidges there. And she said that that this Gullidge manor had been built in 1500, and it had been redone by an architect. And it was still called the Gullidge Manor.
Do you know what part of England?
Yes, it's right 30 miles out of London.
And we're looking at a picture of it right now.
Yes. This architect restored the building. It was in the time of Henry VII. And the smokestacks were visible behind the house. And she came to find out that they were in the armor business. They were making munitions.
And these arms had something to do with the Revolution, isn't that right? The
Yes.
American Revolution?
Yes, they were. It was the ancestral home of the Gullidges, and then they came to Virginia, and from there to Anson County, North Carolina.
You were married in 1927 then,
Yes.
and where did you live after that?
Well, our first place to live was in the attic of an old home. It was the only place Frank could find for us to live. And we had lights in most every corner of the house, and still it was dark and we couldn't see. So, in less than a year, I guess, we got an apartment in an apartment building, in the McKay apartment building, and we lived on the 3rd floor there. We had large rooms. Of course, we had to heat that ourselves, too. We had a heater, a stove to heat with. And we cooked on an oil stove. There was no gas in Middlesboro. You either had a coal range or you cooked on oil, coal oil. And that was not very satisfactory, but that's the way we cooked. We didn't. Later, when we lived there until after our daughter, our first child, was born. Then we moved to a house out on Gloucester Avenue. Incidentally, all the streets in Middlesboro were named after English towns. And it was a very small house, and it was owned by my teacher, my Latin teacher. And everybody in town says he's going to freeze his wife and child to death taking them out there. Their house, he can't keep it warm. Well, we bought a heater, and the hardware store gave us a coal cooking stove, which heated it, and we did very well. We stayed there until the banks closed at the bank holiday, and then we couldn't pay the rent.
Now, these were the banks closed by President Roosevelt?
Yes.
In 1932.
Well, so we moved in with my family. And Susie Roberts said afterwards, she said, you didn't have to move, said you could have stayed there. But we didn't feel like we wanted to stay where we couldn't pay for it. So we stayed with my sister and my mother and father and brother. And then soon after that, my sister worked for the L&N, and they moved the L&N offices to Louisville. And since we had consolidated our furniture in the one house, and they were moving her, paying for her move up here, we just moved with them because he had nothing to do there. He tried to get an employment there, and he couldn't find anything to do after the banks had closed.
Now, were you able to continue working, or were you also out of a job? Of course, you had your first child was born.
I worked until my first child, just before she was born, and I intended to go back to work afterwards, but I didn't. I didn't go back, and then the banks closed. And when we came up here, I tried to get work. I couldn't because there just weren't any jobs to get. And they were giving them to heads of families, if there were any, they said.
And was your husband able to find a job in Louisville?
Well, he wasn't able for a long time, but he got offer of 2 or 3 jobs the same day, I think. He got jobs with an insurance company and Bank of St. Helens. First, the state examiners knew Frank from Middlesboro in the bank, and they recommended him to Mr. Farnsworth when he was looking for somebody to go into the Bank of St. Helens. So he chose the bank because he liked banking, and that's what he had been doing when the holiday came.
And this was in Shockley?
Yes.
But before he worked there, he worked for...
Well, after the banks closed, he did work for Collins Moore as a security salesman. And then he worked for some other security company out of Cincinnati, maybe. But they just weren't selling securities then. So the companies called all the salesmen in.
While he was working at these jobs, where were you living in Louisville?
Well, at first we lived on Lee Street. We had a large apartment there, owned by Vic Lorch, a jeweler. And we were the only Gentiles in the apartment. But they were very nice neighbors. And after we lived there for a year or so, we moved to Beachmont. This was the whole family. We were still with them.
You were still with your parents and
Yes.
your brother and your sister?
Yeah. And then my daughter went to kindergarten in the Beachmont schools.
And by the way, what was the name of this daughter that had been born?
Loretto Rose. She was named for me because she was supposed to be a boy and she wasn't. And my husband got sick when she was born. He just didn't think he could love a girl. He wanted a boy, so they had to put him to bed in the hospital. And there was an elderly citizen there in the hospital as a patient. He heard about it. And he sent for Frank to go to see him, and he said, Frank said he shook his finger at him and said, "Young man, you will rue the day that you ever hoped that child would be a boy." He said, "I have 5 children, and my first one was a girl. She thinks more of her old daddy than all the rest of them put together." So he was reconciled, but it was a shock to him because he just couldn't have anything but a boy. Everybody else had boys, but he couldn't. Very devoted father then, and we got a big baby buggy. He'd push it downtown and make everybody stop and look at her because he was so proud of her. But it was just when it was shocked to him when she was born. He wasn't prepared to have a girl.
And you started to say that your daughter was in kindergarten at Beachmont?
Yes, at Beachmont. And that's when we moved to Shively. We were able to get a home of her own. She finished kindergarten there and then went to Shively, and she was going to enter county school, but they wouldn't admit her because she wouldn't be 6 until the 3rd day of October, and you had to be 6 by the 30th day of December to get in schools. So Father Piper at St. Helens School said, "Well, I'll take her in my school." So we entered her in the Catholic school. And when we did that, then all the people from Mill Creek PTA came and said, "Why did you send her there?" And I said, "Well, you wouldn't take her in the county schools." Well, we could have made some kind of arrangements. But she stayed there for the year. The next year she went to the county schools.
Had you had another child by now, or not yet?
6 years after she was born, we had a boy.
So that would have been 1935. And what was your boy's name?
Franklin Asbury Gullidge, Jr.
And how did your husband feel about that?
Well, when he was born, he started inviting everybody to his graduation from Annapolis. He didn't go to Annapolis, but he did become a Marine helicopter pilot. He was very proud.
And you subsequently had another child?
7 years later, I had Sally.
And by this time, World War II had started. Do you have any particular memories about that era?
Well, I remember the Pearl Harbor Day. I'm in our home at Shively. I just can see the scene when I heard it. And at course Fort Knox filled up with recruits, and my husband would go down to Fort Knox every weekend and get boys who were on leave for the weekend and had nothing to do, and bring them to our house. And they would stay there and eat there. And we met some of the nicest young men that you can imagine that way. He'd just pick them out waiting there. I don't know how he was so lucky, but he was. And my son, who was just a little boy then, was talking about he wanted to go in the Army. And he said, well, you have to wait till you grow up. He said, well, I may not want to go when I grow up. But we didn't have anything fancy. I'd cook a big bowl of spaghetti or something for them to eat. And if the grass needed cutting, they would cut it. Or if I had trouble with the washing machine, they'd fix it. Or it was just... But, you know, then he kept on doing this. But this was in the beginning. Later on, we got 2 or 3 that just weren't nice at all, so we stopped doing it.
About how long did you continue doing this?
Oh, a year, 2. And they really enjoyed it.
Did you keep up with any of the earlier ones?
Not really the ones that stayed with us, but the young officers at Fort Knox, the ones who had just graduated from military school, just commissioned. They were at Fort Knox and they didn't have any housing for them at all. They had to find their own places to live. They brought their families with them. We're talking to Frank. And we're talking about getting trailers, mobile homes. And I suppose that they had a place at Fort Knox. Maybe they had a few there, I don't know. But these young men and their families didn't have the money to buy a trailer. So he started making loans to them to buy these trailers so they could have their families with them. Well, the bank examiners came, and they criticized him severely for making these loans to Army officers at Fort Knox, young men. But he never lost a loan that he made, and they congratulated him afterwards and praised him for doing it, the bank examiners, because it was a good thing. But he said he knew those men would pay, even though the bank examiners thought it was a bad loan. So we kept in contact with those people. They kept their accounts at the magazine yellows when they were sent all over the world, because they remembered what he had done for them.
Did you ever go to Fort Knox yourself?
Oh, yes. We visited them down there and had dinner with them and shopped in the commissary and whatever.
Did you know anyone who went overseas in the war?
Not that war, no.
And once again, do you remember anything about the shortages and anything?
Well, I know we had coupons to get shoes and some sugar, I think, and whatnot. But I never, and gasoline. Of course, my husband was on the rationing board, and he was also on the Board of Appeals for the draft. And gasoline and tires and things like that were rationed. But as far as food was concerned, Sally was a baby, and she was on a bottle, and I didn't want to change the formula that I had for her. So I was able to go to the grocery and get the kind of milk I was making her formula with, and I got a case of that just to have it. But coffee was rationed, but we had all the coffee we want because a lot of my family didn't drink coffee, and they gave me their coupons. Same way with shoes. You could exchange coupons if you didn't need them. So it was really no hardship as far as we were concerned, as far as the rationing was concerned, except maybe for tires and whatnot.
I think I should back up a little bit and ask you what you remember about the flood in 1937.
Well, my husband's grandfather Francis Asbury Gulledge had died. And he went to Alabama. And when he came back, the flood had started. So somebody in Louisville, the mayor or somebody, called him and wanted to know something about sources of fresh water or whatnot. Anyway, he went into where they were trying to locate things, and I was left at home with the 2 children and the radio on. And they kept making these reports on the radio about the West End. Move out from this street and move out from that street. They kept repeating it. And here I was with the 2 children at home, and he was in town doing something with the mayor. So I started carrying things up to the 2nd floor. By the time he got back, I had everything that could be carried up there. If I didn't carry the dining room table or the refrigerator or the stove. But most everything else I had carried up to the 2nd floor. And by that time, the water was all around us. It never did get in our house, but it surrounded our house. And the bank at that time was down at the intersection of 7th and 18th Street in a triangle. And it did get into the bank. But we were evacuated from the house by rowboat, taken over to Dixie Highway, where there were cars taking us to the East End. And my family at that time were living in Crescent Hill. So that's where we ended up staying. Everything in our house was by electricity. We had a pump for our water, and the furnace was, well, we had the coal furnace, but anyway, we wouldn't have had any water or lights. So we stayed with my mother over in Crescent Hill. And our next door neighbor went with us and stayed there too. And I don't know why the boys from the Baptist Seminary were there, but some of them were there. Anyway, she had quite a house full. And they were distributing food to the refugees, and they came by Mother's house, and my daughter, who was about 7 then, answered the door. They wanted to know if she was a refugee. She said, "No, I'm not a refugee. I'm visiting my grandmother." But that was, I only took clothes for my son. He was a baby then. I didn't take her any clothes at all, because we had to go out in the rowboat. But when we got there, then I went down to a little dry goods store in Crescent Hill and bought some material and made her dress so I could have a change for her.
How long did you have to stay at your family's place?
I don't remember exactly. I think at least a week, maybe longer. I don't know. I had a colored lady who had worked for me since Franklin was born. And she lived down here off of Cane Run Road, she and her husband. And I was worried about her because the water came up down there. I finally located her way out, which is not so way out now, but I don't know, Goose Creek or someplace. That's where they had taken them.
Why did the mayor call your husband about...
I guess because he thought he was familiar with the resources of the area.
Why would he think that?
Well, I don't know.
How did your husband and the mayor know each other?
Well, because he was in the bank, I guess. I never thought about it, and I don't know.
Do you remember the mayor, calling on your husband for any other reason? At
No,
any other time?
I don't remember. I think it was just that particular.
Back to the end of World War II, and what transpired after the war?
Well, my daughter, Loretto Rose, graduated from Valley High School. And at that time, I understand, the colleges were being swamped with people coming back from the Army, veterans, entering college. And I talked to our minister, Andrew Anderson, and he said that he had an in with the president of Lake Forest College in Lake Forest, Illinois, and he would write him and tell him about Loretto. So she was accepted at Lake Forest, Illinois, and she entered college there. At that time, I started going to U of L night school. The reason I could do that was because Frank's mother was living with us, but she had been living with us for a long time because his stepfather died before my son was born. And she came to live with us. And I could go to school at night. And my children thought it was so strange because other people's mothers didn't go to school.
Why did you decide to do that?
Because I've always wanted to.
And never were able to?
Well, I wasn't able to go young, and then I got married and I had all the children, and I thought I had a chance that I could go, and I just got too much curiosity. I wanted to know things. I took, well, before that time, my husband had gone to U of L to take a course in public speaking. And so he was going there, so I went with him, and I took a course in interior design by Lillian Timmons. And funny, because he had a class at U of L, I guess, I don't know, something about him being admitted there because he didn't have a formal education. But anyway, he enjoyed it. And then one time, a year after he quit, the instructor of the public speaking asked Frank to come back and take care of the class for him when he went on vacation.
Did he do it?
Yes.
And the interior design course was the first course you took?
Yes, I took that. But then that was before Loretto went to college. But I went back and started in earnest in the regular course, and I took psychology. That was my main interest. And so I went long enough to get all the psychology I needed for a degree. And I only needed a few hours in sociology. But by that time, my husband wasn't feeling very well. It took me years to do this. And he had to have a cataract operation. And he became very helpless. And I couldn't leave him to go to school, so I never got the few hours that I needed to get the degree. But I thoroughly enjoyed going to these classes. And I had done my thesis for the psychology. I did on the Rorschach test. But then, after I couldn't go to college, then I started in the garden club and flower arranging. I could do that. But before that, when my son was a baby, I started in the homemakers club. Because they said then that if you went to that, the instructors came out of the University of Kentucky, and if you studied that, it was equal to taking a class in nutrition at the University of Kentucky. We studied all about vitamins and whatnot. So I enjoyed that, and I'm still a homemaker. So it's all along the way I've just done this and that and the other. And I know a little bit about a lot of things and not much about anything.
Sometime after you joined the garden club, you became a nationally accredited flower show judge.
Yes, several years. It takes several years to work up to that. You have to go to symposiums in schools and whatnot and pass examinations.
Were you able to do that here in Louisville?
Oh, yes, it was all done here.
Did you ever actually do any judging?
Oh, yes, I'm still judging. I've done, not so much now because they don't have so many flower shows now, but in the beginning I did quite a bit of judging. We'd go out all over the state. And I judged once in Florida. We were visiting down there, and I visited a garden club, and they needed a judge, and so I judged a show there.
Did you do a certain amount of traveling? After you moved to Louisville, did you have opportunities to travel?
Oh, you mean vacations?
Generally?
The most traveling we did was to Florida. My husband loved to go to Florida. I didn't care anything about Florida at all, but he loved it. The first time I went there, I guess I enjoyed it. But I would go with him. And one time the National Garden Club was sponsoring a tour of Europe.